thinking about the mathematics of redistricting is the thing which I haven't been doing for particularly long, but it's sort of adjacent to my own sort of original mathematical interests, and I think there's some really cool things here which I want to share with you today. I'm going to try to keep it minimally quantitative, and we'll sort of see how it goes. So I first have the obligatory picture of the gerrymander, and I want to sort of emphasize here, so we're thinking about the manipulation of district boundaries for the purpose of achieving an unfair advantage for a party or group. And I think that the word that I want to sort of drill in on in a technical way is this word unfair. What does that mean exactly? And how can we use mathematics, right? So, and I also want to remind you that Pennsylvania has its own sort of infamous history in gerrymandering with the District 7, which they call the Goofy Kicking Donald district. I guess this is Goofy, I think, and this is Donald. I'm not sure, but so this is not something which is far from home for us, right? This is thankfully not what it looks like anymore. Okay, so I want to begin with an exercise to sort of think about this word unfair. Okay, so we know that it's a problem, right? You read the newspaper and you know that anytime that you have restricted access to who gets to draw the boundaries, it sort of seems like you get these weird shaped regions and that people are entrenching their own interests in the system. And so let's do the following sort of thought experiment. I mean, it's the 21st century. We all have internet access. Suppose that we try to just erase completely the geographic features of districting. And the idea is, let's say we have a state with 10 million voters in it. Suppose that we want to divide it into 10 districts. Suppose that we all just want to vote by our phones and it doesn't matter where we are. So let's just take all 10 million voters and just randomly assign them to a district, okay? So I'm going to just take a 10-sided coin for each voter and flip it, and whatever number comes up, that's what district you're in, okay? And let's say that we live in a world where there are two parties, Party A and Party B, and let's say that Party A is sort of 45% of voters identify with Party A and 55% of voters identify with Party B, okay? So we're going to do this process of completely erasing all maps and just randomly putting people together. What happens in this? How many districts? So suppose we do this, we have votes, they each elect one representative. How many districts go for Party A and how many for Party B? Yeah?
You all go for Party B.
Exactly. In this system, the party with the slight majority gets all of the districts, right? Because each district is a 55-45 district that represents the whole, right? And so, I mean, that's excellent, by the way. I've asked many smart people that question, and they all get it wrong the first time. So that's exactly what happens, right? So it's a process which sort of seems fair. Certainly you're treating all voters in exactly the same way, but it has a very significant impact on the balance of power, right? And so there's a real question when you have complicated interests that are represented by more than one party and you want to divide it up, it's not at all obvious what the right distribution of representation even should be, right? Okay, so in the system as we live in it, geography is important. And in fact, I think one of my points of going through this exercise is to emphasize that the geography of the geographic distribution of voters is extremely important in our system. That's something so I mean, you can decide for yourself whether or not you think it should be that way, but in the system that we have, the places that people live are incredibly important in what happens, okay? Now, my own interest is particularly in using mathematics and quantitative methods to understand ways that these maps can be drawn fairly and in a nonpartisan way. So I want to talk mostly about criteria that are nonpartisan. And the good news is that the courts sort of across the country have a fairly standard list of criteria that they consider important and that are also nonpartisan. So when we're talking about drawing district maps, what are some of the things that are important? Well, the first is is contiguity. That if you're talking about a district, it should just be one piece. It shouldn't count some people over here and then sort of disconnected. And over here, there's some notion that it should be possible to drive from any point in the district to any other point in the district without leaving the district, right? There's the concept of population balance, right? That they shouldn't have widely different populations. There are some situations in which you can't actually require them to be exactly equal, right? Like if you have 10 districts and 11 voters, somebody is going to have to be in it. But generally speaking, the goal is to have the populations be as close to equal as is theoretically possible. There's a notion of compactness, right? That when you have a district, it shouldn't have lots of weird tendrils and things. That somehow or another it should be one nice little piece. That's one criteria that the gerrymander example clearly fails, right? That it's not the right shape, it's not compact. It should, to the extent that it's possible, preserve existing boundaries, right? If you don't have to divide cities or counties or precincts or anything like this into smaller pieces, then you should not do that. And in Pennsylvania, the language is particularly strong. The language is that these existing regions should be kept intact unless absolutely necessary, is the sort of legal language that's used around this division. There are other sort of criteria that are imposed by other laws. For example, the Voting Rights Act imposes constraints on sort of the ability of minority communities to elect a candidate of their own choice, right? And the Voting Rights Act also sort of includes sort of a broader notion of what representation should mean in terms of not just sort of racial or ethnic minorities, but communities of interest, which is a term which is, as a mathematician, not as well defined as I would like it to be, but it's a thing which is out there. Okay, and of course these are just the criteria which you would call the neutral criteria, right? So there's certainly lots of other. If you were drawing your own map, there may be many other things that you might be interested in, but these are the ones which are which we hope that everyone can agree are important criteria. Right? So the idea of computational redistricting is to sort of take these neutral criteria and put them in a form that you can set a computer to work drawing maps. Okay, and this was a thing which was largely, there's theoretical work on redistricting, mathematics sort of theory of redistricting that goes back quite a long ways. But in terms of actually doing this is a relatively recent phenomenon that before 2010, you didn't really see these kinds of things being done in practice, but the sort of computing technology is increasing at an exponential rate, and we are now at the point where you can take computers and set them to work doing this job. Now you might ask, how in the world can you have a computer draw a map, because it involves drawing lines and things like this? But it's a problem which is very well suited to a computer because of the requirement that you should keep sort of existing entities intact unless at all possible. So really, sort of to get a computer to draw a map, all you have to do is tell it what all of these entities are, and tell it which ones border which ones, and then ask them to put them together in lumps, right? So it's not really so much an issue of sort of drawing lines as it is sort of just adding labels to the different pieces. Which should this be in the red district or the yellow district or the green district or the blue district? And so what I've got here is I'm as a mathematician, I am sort of extremely afraid of the real world. So I have some completely artificial maps to show you that I generated. And what we have is these maps are generated a bunch of little hexagonal cells. And I've got two parties in my universe. There's the purple party and the green party. And geographically, the way they're distributed is that the top of the hexagon is extremely green, and the bottom of the hexagon is extremely purple. Okay, and it sort of moves gradually. Sort of in the middle here, it's pretty evenly mixed. And just to sort of, even though I'm afraid of reality, I feel like I have to represent it somehow. So I've got some lakes or something in my region so that you can sort of see how the shape of this is impacting things. And we've got a couple of maps three maps that are generated by a computer. Here they're colored so that you can see what the districts actually are. And here they're colored by the sort of population that lives in that district. So sort of this dark green one is one that's very intensely green. and this one is very intensely purple, and these ones that are colors in the middle are ones that are sort of more competitive, okay? And you can sort of see how it lays out. Here there are sort of, in each of these maps, there are 2 districts that are primarily green and 3 that are primarily purple, but they have different levels of competitiveness. So how do we actually do this in practice? Well, the theory that's behind this is a concept called a Markov chain Monte Carlo. And the idea is that you want to generate not just one map, but you want to generate a huge number of maps and then compare them, right? Because there's this issue of how do you decide what is fair? Like, just because you don't like the outcome doesn't mean that it's not fair, right? And so what we want to do is we want to generate a very, very large number of maps, millions or billions of maps, and just look and see what happens. And we're going to generate them in a way which is explicitly and verifiably nonpartisan. We're going to write a computer program to generate these maps, share the code with anybody who wants to read it so that you can see that there were no partisan considerations that were put into this algorithm, okay? And the way that it works, when you make a huge, huge set of maps, you're not focused on making the best map possible because you want to understand what the range of reasonable maps is. So you make them essentially randomly, okay? And the process that we use, so there are many different processes, but there's sort of one of the sort of cutting edge examples of techniques is called reversible recombination. And the idea with reversible recombination is that you take a map, you randomly choose 2 districts that are adjacent, and you glue them together to make one mega district. And then you take a pair of scissors and you cut them apart again. But you might cut them apart, and presumably you should cut them apart in a different way than they were originally glued together, so that you shift that boundary a little bit. And when you do the cutting, you make sure to preserve the population balance so that they have approximately equal numbers of people in each one. But other than that, you don't really care about anything. You don't care about making the shortest cut that you can. You don't care about anything at all. And so you get some maps which are really good and some maps which are really bad, right? And you keep them all. And you look and you just sort of see what the range of things is that happens, okay? So here's an example. So I ran this sort of virtual hexagonal simulation 1,000,000 times and generated 1,000,000 maps. And you take this thing and you just look at things that you care about. For example, you can look at the perimeter of districts, right? If you are concerned about compactness, right? One telltale sign of a district not being compact is it has a really, really long boundary, that somehow or another it takes a long time to drive around the edge of it. So I'm not making a value judgment about perimeter. I'm just saying, what were the different perimeters that came out when I generated this process? And you can see that there's some kind of like bell curve that occurs, right? And the idea is that we can use this bell curve as a way of calibrating our expectations. If I give you a plan that has extremely large perimeter, that's an indication that something is wrong. That even though I looked at millions of maps, I never really saw any sort of significant number of maps that had a very, very long perimeter. Here's another sort of quantity that you can look at, because there are lots of different ways you can evaluate maps. This one is one that I'll call unhappy neighbors. The idea is, suppose that you draw a district boundary right by somebody's house. And so they're sitting right in this house and they're right on the boundary. Would they have rather that you had drawn it the other way so they would be in the other district? Right? So this is sort of capturing the sort of very, very local nature of the boundary. And you can sort of see that there's some kind of bell curve where there's something that's sort of typical. There are things where people are sort of happier, maybe people are sort of more unhappy. And also you can look, right, once you generate the maps, you can compare them to your data about voting preferences, and you can see how they come out. And you can see that in this universe that we made, about more than 80% of the time, there were 2 green districts and 3 purple, like the ones that I showed you on the previous slide. And there's a reason for that. It turns out that those little lakes screw things up and make it harder to have many green districts, right? So again, we have geographic features dictating the political outcome, right? Which is strange, but it's just the nature of districting, right? Occasionally, about 20% of the time, it was 3 green and 2 purple. Very, very rarely, like 0.1% of the time, it was 1 green and 4 purple. And actually never in 1,000,000 maps was it 4 green and 1 purple. It didn't happen at all, okay? So then what you do is you take this ensemble of maps, and when someone presents you a map, you can compare their map to your ensemble. So here's a map from my hypothetical legislature. And I take this map and I evaluate it, I compare it to the bell curve, and you can see, Well, the boundaries are a little bit long. It's kind of unusual, but not terribly unusual. The neighbors are kind of unhappy. Well, actually, they're a little bit happy, but a little unusual. But this is a 4 green, 1 purple district, which didn't happen out of a million shot. And so something is weird about this map, right? And so you can use this sort of completely nonpartisan data to help contextualize. The other thing you can do, once you have a really powerful computer, if you're in the business of drawing the maps, you can sort of take the same process, generating billions of maps, and if you're the one that's drawing the map, you can then just take the best one, right? So whatever criteria you have for best, you can sort of do that. And so this is sort of how I originally got involved in this, was after the 2020 census in Pennsylvania, we had to redraw district boundaries because we lost a district from 18 to 17, not because the population went down, but because we didn't grow as quickly as everybody else, right? So it was necessary to redraw the map. So I was one of about a dozen or so mathematicians who sort of banded together and decided to sort of throw our hat in the ring and draw a map and then submit it for consideration, right? Because in principle, in Pennsylvania, this is a process which is supposed to be decided by the legislature and approved by the governor, but when you have a situation in which they can't agree, then it goes to the courts, right? So here we have a list of all mathematicians, data scientists, all of us living in Pennsylvania, all of us living in a district which, in which our voting power was diluted because of the change of population, okay? And so here's our map. This is, you can sort of see how it works. This was generated by exactly the process that I described, right? That you generate many, many, many maps. You look at fairness criteria in our case. You pick ones that are sort of the most natural in terms of fairness. What did we have? We had a lot going. Our map, to toot our own horn, we had a lot going for our map. We had best possible population balance. The difference in population between districts was at most 1 person. We had the fewest number of split political subdivisions. In reality, to get that kind of precision, you have to occasionally split things into pieces, but we had the fewest splits. We had best scores for certain measures of compactness. We tied the Carter plan. There were about a dozen other maps submitted. We tied the Carter plan for the best efficiency gap and had other sort of measures that were sort of really strong for our map. But one thing that we had that nobody else had was we had a third majority-minority district, but they didn't pick our map. Which is okay, because the Carter plan was a really strong map as well, and it was certainly better than the maps that were on the table beforehand. And there was a reason for that, and that's because justices on the Supreme Court take into account many, many considerations in addition to just the neutral criteria. And the main difference between the Carter plan and our plan was that the Carter plan was based on a principle of least change. So they specifically wanted to design a map which was as close as possible to the existing one, which was a consideration that we didn't have. Okay, but we did have at least one shout out from Justice Todd, so I'll sort of put this here as well, right? Which is to say that to emphasize that the mathematics is important. It's not the only story, because at the end of the day, you also have to have an argument which is compelling, right? And there are many other criteria that go into it. And we managed to convince at least one person on the court that, like, taking this computational approach and going back to this keeping political subdivisions intact unless absolutely necessary, like Justice Todd found that word absolutely necessary to be more compelling than some of the other justices, and consequently, since we had the minimum number of subdivisions, that was what she liked. But other justices have other criteria that they evaluated on. What's the point here? I think the point is that these mathematical tools can, at minimum, make this process more transparent, right? That you can, as a map drawer, you can explicitly state your priorities, and you can do it in a way that other people can verify that you stuck to, right? So that that we all know it's on the same page, and we take the map drawing out of the back room and into into the public sphere, where we can debate the values, we can talk about the priorities that go into it, but we all at least know that there's nobody's hiding anything anymore. All right, so I think that is where I would like to leave it.
Thanks, that was great. And I want to thank Jose as well for the super kind introduction. So if Dr. Gressman talked primarily about how we would, given a set of constraints, then optimize the maps that we draw, I want to talk a little bit, I want to take a step back and think about how we get to those constraints and which constraints are more or less in tension with others. So as folks know, single-member districts, which we take for granted in the US, we use them here in Philadelphia, we use them at the state level, we use them in Congress, are not the only way to represent citizens. And I think for many of those of us who've been socialized entirely in the American political system, it may seem unexpected that a variety of other high-functioning democracies use other approaches. So for instance, the Republic of Ireland just recently redrew boundaries. The Republic of Ireland is interesting in that the process is not done by politicians. Do you want me to use this? Yeah. Okay. The process is not done by politicians, and importantly, they have districts of varying sizes, which gives them another parameter that they can use to approach this kind of very complex optimization problem. So other systems can use multi-member districts. You have some systems where at least part of the legislature is filled through a single national district, sometimes through proportional representation. You could also think, as Dr. Gressman mentioned, about non-geographic forms of representation. Why is it that I should necessarily be represented by, alongside the 800,000 people who are most physically proximate to me, rather than, for example, the 8,000 people who share my line of work, right? Could you imagine a world where professors had a district, or where students had a district, or multiple districts? And redistricting also necessarily involves a whole set of values, and those values are going to come into conflict. So for example, we may value keeping incumbents. So from the point of view of our state, given that Congress prioritizes seniority, we might want to send members of Congress who are incumbents, who've been elected, back to Congress again and again so they can accrue seniority and bring home the bacon for Philadelphia or Bucks County or wherever. Dr. Gressman talked about different kinds of communities of interest. You can imagine that we might want to draw boundaries that guaranteed partisan competitiveness. So we might want to draw as many districts as possible where there was legitimate competition between the parties, and that might lead then to a very volatile system where in one election, all of the seats in Pennsylvania go to one party, and in another election, very few do, right? Also, our legal system has embedded a minority representation as one important goal among many. And so part of what I'm trying to say is that there is both a set of questions about algorithmically how do we approach this very interesting problem, and also politically and ethically, what are the values that we're going to use? If we have committed ourselves to a geographic system, which in the 21st century we may not need to, right? We can think about other ways of representing ourselves. And certainly, if I think about, say, the political science department, in faculty meetings, we don't vote based on who's on the 4th floor and who's on the 3rd floor, or who has an office that is, facing south. So one of the critical questions is just what are we optimizing? Another point that I want to make is that even sometimes ostensibly neutral criteria can actually have significant partisan consequences. And one of the things I want to point out is the way in which Democrats can naturally be disadvantaged by, say, compactness criteria. And redistricting is also, we think of it as one often ill in our political system, but, and we often focus on congressional redistricting, right? But I'm going to argue that actually we should be more worried about redistricting at the state level. The reason for that is that, yes, there are Democratic states like Maryland that are going to gerrymander their congressional districts and send a disproportionate number of Democrats to Congress relative to their population. But there are also Republican states like Texas that are going to do the same. And so in the federal legislature, in Congress, it roughly will balance out. Now, I think there are other arguments for why congressional gerrymandering is a problem, but it's less of a problem in Congress, where gerrymandering may, on balance, cost the Democrats or the Republicans in different years 5 seats, 10 seats, than in state houses, where in a state house, say the Wisconsin legislature draws the boundaries for every seat in Wisconsin. And that's very, very different than having 50 different legislatures or the number of legislatures that have more than one congressional district drawing boundaries. So it's an obligatory slide. I have obliged. But that was the northern shore of Massachusetts, where Elbridge Gerry famously had drawn that district. And anybody who's from Massachusetts or the north shore of Boston may recognize the oddness even then. Though it's worth pointing out that nowadays, all of these towns are probably represented together because congressional districts are much, much, much bigger than they were 200 years ago. So the partisan consequences of redistricting can be real and very meaningful. So for example, in North Carolina, redistricting at different times has been used by both parties. The Democrats had redistricted North Carolina after the 2000 census. And then, worried that they were going to lose control of the redistricting process, the Democrats, who still controlled the legislature and didn't anticipate that they would lose the legislature, changed the law so that the governor would no longer have a veto over the redistricting process. And then, surprise, surprise, the Democrats in 2008 held on to the governor's chair, but then in 2010 they lost the legislature, and so Republicans drew the boundaries in the next election. And even though in 2012 Democrats had won almost 51% of the two-party House vote, they got just 46% of the seats. So another concern, and Dr. Gressman mentioned this, relates to density and compactness. Now, drawing districts based on compactness may seem like a neutral, and it is on its face ostensibly a politically neutral criterion to use, but it actually has profound partisan consequences. So two political scientists engaged in a really interesting exercise. So you may remember that the 2000 Florida presidential election was decided by, 537 votes. So it was razor tight in a state with millions and millions of voters. So it was essentially tied. So the exercise that Chen and Rodden engaged in was to randomly redistrict Florida with legislatures they took the voter file and they identified districts based entirely on compactness. Let's get voters as close as possible to one another. And then they varied the size of the simulated legislature. So you'll remember that we know in Florida in 2000, voters were exactly evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. But if you use those presidential returns, what happens is, I'll get that later, as you draw more and more districts, right? You draw 10 districts, and you're going to draw a legislature, if you just use the compactness criterion, that is more than 60% Republican. Why is that? Because Democrats live in tighter spatial concentration than Republicans do on average, right? There are a whole bunch of 85-15 Democratic-leaning districts, including the one that we're in right now. But there are virtually no 85-15 Republican districts, because rural areas, which are often give support to Republicans, are divided more maybe 2-to-1. So you can still find Democrats. So Democrats' votes from the point of view of districting by compactness are distributed less efficiently. And even if you just use compactness, you can see that Republicans are getting a meaningful advantage until we're talking about legislatures of 10,000 districts. So compactness itself, though entirely a neutral criterion, has important partisan consequences. So we talked about that. So I would just say this, that the United States embeds space into its notions of representation, and it's not clear that we need to do this or that this is optimal in the 21st century. There are a variety of alternatives, and I think it's worth thinking through. So for instance, India has quotas for election by gender and by caste. So you can think about alternative systems of representation beyond simply representing people by virtue of where they live. All districting involves values and often a trade-off between values. And I think that even if every person in the room could agree that partisan gerrymandering as it's functioning right now is inappropriate, the challenge comes, and indeed the most recent Supreme Court case to consider partisan redistricting, to some degree fell apart on the question of, okay, what criteria are we going to use? What values are we going to use? We could use partisan motives. We could want to promote competition. We could want to protect incumbents. We could want to maximize a given party's seats. And we could try to maximize a party's seats given a favorable environment. And it's actually been very interesting as a political observer to see that in recent years, the parties have adjusted the strategy that they're using. So that some parties, for example, the Republicans in Texas, drew a map that didn't get as many Republican seats as they possibly could out of it, but was designed to withstand a significant Democratic surge. So this is a map that won't maximize Republican seats, but it will minimize the number of seats that the Democrats will win in a very pro-Democratic year, right? And that is one criterion that you could use. Interestingly, in some states like Nevada, the Democrats pursued a different approach of trying to maximize competitive seats that were slightly Democratic leaning, on the idea that if the national environment is slightly favorable towards the Democrats, Nevada Democrats wanted to have 3 of maybe the 4 seats in the state. But that's a different strategy. And it's worth noting that even in one redistricting cycle, different states and different parties are opting for different strategies. So I really look forward to your questions, and thanks, everybody.
Alrighty, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you.
Hi. Just about the last slide about Texas, when you say they're not maximizing Republican seats, but they are minimizing the risk of Democrats getting more seats, I didn't understand that difference.
Okay, so it's a great question, and it's worth keeping in mind that the parties are thinking about redistricting over a 10-year period. And it used to be, in a less polarized era, that 10 years out, politics was really hard to predict. Nowadays, as polarization has set in, it's easier to predict, okay, this district is trending to have more Latino voters, more highly educated voters. Here's where we see it going. And so Republicans in Texas made a decision to draw boundaries in a way such that the seats that they hold, they would be able to hold even in a Democratic surge year. So they basically built a high firewall, but in return, they left some votes on the table in the sense that they conceded to the Democrats a few seats that they potentially could have won in a good Republican year, but put at risk in a good Democratic year. So they made the decision to basically like create a firewall in a certain sense, to say, even in a bad year for Republicans, we'll still win at least these seats. Of course.
Apologies for my crude knowledge in American political system, but it looks like that on a frequent basis we are redistricting different states, like you gave an example of Nevada and Texas. So do you feel like, since you talked about how few factors can be quantified, so do you feel there is a need for a consensus across the country or across states to have more of a neutral system where it doesn't really favor any particular party?
One small tweak that I would make is that it's not so much that it's difficult to quantify, but it's just that there are many, many different things that you can quantify, right? And so there's a question of agreement. I think that's, to my mind, that's a question that goes beyond the scope of, I think, what I can answer, right? Because certainly we all have different values, right? And we all have different priorities. And when I think of the problem, I think of it as one of let's just be candid about what we're doing, right? As a first step, right? Maybe certainly, yeah, I think it would be better if we could all agree on what our values were, but I don't think that that's going to happen.
Yeah, no, and I would just add that many other democracies don't allow the politicians to be as directly involved in this process. And I think you certainly could imagine, and indeed some U.S. states have boundary drawing commissions, which are composed in different ways. It is a challenge for us, but there are a wide range of other systems which have managed to come up with, if you can write down the set of values you want the commission to pursue, often these independent commissions can return entirely defensible boundaries.
We have a question.
I guess I had two questions. The first, in talking about the redistricting in Pennsylvania, was the previous map, because my memory is correct, the one before the current one came from the courts. Was that one also based on modeling, or was it based on something else?
There has been software for a long time that aids human beings to make maps, but this current census was really the first time that we've seen a significant change in taking people out of the process almost entirely.
Okay. Yeah. Then I was also curious whether there's concern or risk of, I guess, the same techniques that are being used to draw fair maps being used in states where the legislator allows it to draw maps that are even more gerrymandered.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true, right? Because you can, if you're generating an ensemble of 1 billion maps, you can pick whichever one you want. And if you have partisan goals, you can go through all 1 billion maps and pick the one that gets your party the most seats, right? So there's nothing intrinsically fair about the fact that it's been quantified, right? But what it does do is that it allows us to raise the expectations of transparency, right? It allows us to raise the standards of the burden of proof when you in math you've got to show your work, right? And that's kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah, just to add to that, Sean Trendy is a political analyst who refers to gerrymanders at the end of the 10-year cycle as a dummy mander, because oftentimes it's very hard to predict in 10 years exactly which areas are going to be trending in what direction. But I do think that the combination of increased computational technology and political polarization has made the work of gerrymandering much easier, because voters' loyalties are more predictable and we have more and more powerful tools. So nowadays, if you were working on a boundary drawing commission, you can say, hey, what happens if we pull this neighborhood out, and then a couple lines of code, and you can see how that affects partisanship. And so yes, these tools can be used for good or for ill, and it's a political question rather than an algorithmic question how we use them. But I do think that part of Dr. Gressman's great point is that if we have open source methods that we all can see the code, then we're putting our values into the code and we can see what those values are.
Hi, I have another one. Do you know, approximately what % of new district maps were drawn using these, large model computational tools?
So that's a good question. It is still a novel thing. It is not a thing that's being used in a huge fraction of the cases. But there are two, right? There are really two ways that you see this going in. One is in actually generating the maps, and this, like I say, this is really the present day is really the first time that we've been in a situation where that could be done. But what's much more common is using these computational tools to set expectations, and you see quite a few court cases around the country where you have sort of data science experts going in and using these kinds of methods to testify on behalf of one party or another about the fairness or unfairness of a particular map. And so that's something which is more common. You see these methods used more commonly to evaluate maps which were created from who knows where than you see it being used to generate original maps.
Hi. So I want to understand more about what the ideal solution would be. And so you brought this up in the beginning of if there's a 55-45 split, then perhaps it seems unfair if all of them go to the 55 versus the 45. So the question is an ideal solution to have the districts map on to that probability more? So 55% of the districts go to A versus B? If so, why not add that in as a constraint in the model? And if not, why isn't that the ideal solution?
Well, I think this is, it's interesting because this question of optimal is intrinsically tied to the concept of your values, right? I can say that Just from a purely technical side, if you knew, for example, that there was a 55-45 split, you may still not be able to achieve that, right? Like depending on the number of districts you have, maybe you only have 10 districts, and so you could have 60-40 or 50-50, and then you're still in a position where you have to decide which way do you want to round. And so there's the problem is so constrained that there is really no concept of the optimal solution. Like no matter what you do, you're going to have to sacrifice something, and that's not even to touch the question of, well, what do we? I mean, we really should agree, right? Like if we have a 55-45 split, like since there isn't an automatic way to make that happen, we sort of have to agree on what we want to happen instead, right? So it's unfortunately not a simple enough problem that we can leave our disagreements at the door, right?
And just one complexity that I would add is the fact that states have control over the redistricting process in their states, but what we want ultimately is a responsive national legislature, right? And so that creates challenging coordination problems where the optimal system for New York to represent New York may differ from the optimal system in New York to represent the country as a whole, right? So if New York legislators know that Texas has drawn the map I just showed, which is a disproportionately Republican map given their voters, if the New York Democrats who run the state legislature want to represent New York voters, their maps may be optimized in a certain direction, but if they want to some extent counterbalance what Texas is doing, they may make a different set of choices. And those are both ethically defensible. And so I think one of the real challenges here is that we decentralize our boundary drawing to the 50 states, or as many states as have multi-member districts. To have more than one member in a district, in a state.
Thank you. Great presentation. Given the backdrop that we're having this in of the inability to choose a Speaker of the House of Representatives, and just as a layperson, I wonder, my layperson belief is that the whole notion of building competitive districts seems to be the least value-laden and perhaps the greatest good for the most people. But do you, as a political scientist, think that's true, or is that also, you think, just a value-laden decision that is completely policy-laden and can't be quantified in any way?
That's a good question, and I do think that our system, for all of its faults, does create some balance between competitive districts. So, Dr. Gressman started with the example where if we drew a set of districts for a 55-45 population randomly, we would, with almost probability 1, generate a lot of districts where the party that had 55% would win them all. And I think that, so what would that mean in practice? That would mean that if the country flipped slightly, members of Congress could change wholesale. We could see lots and lots of new members. And so we probably, to be a functional democracy, we probably want a set of really competitive districts. But if you think about it from the point of view of representation, what maximizes the probability that my partisanship aligns with my representative is actually not a competitive district. Like districts right here, in what we're in the 2nd district. Did they rename it to the 3rd? You can tell me. But like districts that are 85-15 districts, a lot of us share the partisanship of the member of Congress. And so I worry about either a Congress where everybody represents an 85-15 district, or a Congress where everybody represents a 49.99 district. And I do think that some level of balance, but then it's odd because some states have redistricted through commission. So for instance, of the most competitive seats, 2 of them are in eastern Iowa. And I think that's great, but I also would love to see some balance in competitive seats around the country.
I'm over here now. Thank you both for the really fascinating presentations. And I wanted to ask about a variable that came up only tangentially in Dr. Hopkins' presentation, which is assembly size. So there was this Chen and Rodden study showing that the Florida legislature would have to be 10,000 seats before Democrats would gain fair representation for their share of voters. And the U.S. House of Representatives has been capped at 435 members since 1913 or 1929 was when the law was passed to cap it. But political scientists, particularly Rain Tagapera, has proposed the cube root law for representation, which is that the number of seats in the legislature should be the cube root of the population. If that were applied to the United States, we should have 693 or so seats in the House of Representatives. And if there were more seats, then you would have fewer trade-offs on these values that you're trying to optimize in terms of compactness, equal population across districts, and so on. And so my question is whether, on the mathematical side, has anyone tried to model what would be the optimum number of seats for the House of Representatives in order to avoid the kinds of trade-offs that you're trying to deal with in your simulations?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I think this is not something that you'll find a lot of work on, right? That somehow the mathematical work, it's interesting, right? Because mathematicians have not been in this game for a particularly long time. There's a really, really excellent group, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group at Tufts University, which I want to give a shout out to. And they, contrary to like the sort of tradition of mathematicians, they stick to very, very concrete questions. And so they are working on they are training mathematicians to be expert witnesses in court cases. They are simulating actual maps as they actually appear. I think the focus of this group is to have is to be an agent for the sort of actual social change rather than I think they're trying very hard to keep it on the ground and very concrete. But yeah, I think that it's computationally, it's also like if we started talking about 10, if we multiply the number of districts by 10, this is something that's still feasible. Probably mathematically, you wouldn't see a huge change in how much freedom you have in the system until you start multiplying it by 100 or 1,000, and then it becomes a question of is that realistic? Is that ever going to happen?
Just imagine the challenge the House Republicans would have in electing a speaker if they were coordinating like 25,000 of them.
And this will be our last question. Should be our last question.
So you kind of alluded to earlier, like other countries have like multi-member like district systems. I was kind of wondering, like, if you're modeling like those type of districts, what kind of different factors that might come up in like those districts?
I think, and I'm sure Dr. Gressman will jump in on this, but just to start, one of the critical things that in the U.S. context we often take as sort of for granted is that there are two political parties. But these different systems also give rise to different party strategies and different candidate strategies. And I think that that is a really important factor as we think about designing our electoral institutions more generally, rather, as we get beyond just how do we optimally draw boundaries in a two-party system. And so, for instance, I mentioned the Republic of Ireland, where smaller parties want bigger districts, because if there's going to be 5 members elected from Cork, then the smaller parties have a chance maybe not of winning the first or the second or the third seat, but the fourth or the fifth. And so these decisions, it's not like the party system is just taken as a given, though I think in the US our party system feels so kind of rock solid and immovable that we kind of assume, okay, the Republicans and Democrats are going to learn how to compete under any new system. But I think that some reforms, like California's reforms, the goal would be, in the medium term, potentially to change the party's behaviors. And in particular, if we can encourage the parties to not nominate quite such extreme candidates in certain circumstances. One of the things that I have really been interested in is the fact that there's no necessary reason why the parties that compete nationally have to be the parties that compete at the state or local level, right? We're going to have an election in Philadelphia where the Democratic mayoral candidate is widely expected to win because there are a lot of Democrats in Philadelphia, but not so much because of a specific interaction with these candidates. And so I am particularly excited about electoral reforms that would create some space for state and local alternatives that don't necessarily map neatly onto the national two-party division.
I think I don't have much to add to that, except just to say, you know, there are other things that, I mean, as mathematicians we find are interesting about sort of electoral reform is the idea of changing the way that we actually tabulate votes and using things like ranked choice voting or approval voting or things like this, right? That like these are really numerically and sort of quantitatively very interesting, and they can also, you know, they can also really improve some really complicated things that we have around, specifically around the fact that we have a system that we all imagine as two-party, but that isn't actually two-party, right? There are a lot of weird negative features about that as well.
Unfortunately, it's time for us to conclude today's program. Join me in thanking Professors Gressman and Professor Hopkins.